Welcome, bienvenidos. This is Nuestro South podcast, Loud and Proud. We are picking up our conversation from our previous episode on Las Polleras de Mississippi. Part 2 takes a deeper dive into the history and context of these polleras through the research and work of Professor Angela Stuesse. We hope that you enjoyed this conversation and take some of this history to inform your own experiences. This is for us, y'all. I think the first big picture context thing that I wanted to talk about is if you could just do a sort of short recap of what was the rise of the poultry industry in central Mississippi like. So when it happened and kind of who those actors were that established that in Mississippi.
Okay, well, the poultry industry in Mississippi, but also really across the South, sort of began to grow into an industry around World War II. Before that, most people were raising chickens in their backyard for consumption at home. Maybe they had some extras and they were able to sell them or sell the eggs. But it was during World War II that American consumption of poultry began growing, and they were able to sort of ship it across the South and across state lines, across the country, and the industry began to rise. And in Mississippi, which is the place that I know most closely, at that point, the labor force was mostly poor white women. So working class white women, maybe single women, maybe women whose husbands were away at war. And it stayed a largely female and white workforce in Mississippi through the 1960s. Now, as you are probably well aware, there was a civil rights movement that was growing, right? Across the region and across the country in the 50s and 60s. And in the 60s, there were a lot of really important gains in the civil rights movement around voting rights, right, around civil rights. And by the late 60s, Black folks in the South were turning their sights to economic rights, right? We should, a lot of folks were still working on farms, in people's homes as domestic workers. This was essentially the same work that their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had done under slavery, right? In some cases in Mississippi, on the same land that their families had been enslaved on.
Yeah, and I think that's a great context to include because, so I'm a person in North Carolina, and I'm a young person who has grown up in North Carolina. And so even though I've grown up in parts of the South, I don't think I have a context of like what a state like Mississippi is right now or what it was historically. So it's super interesting to hear some of that history. As someone from the South, sometimes I hear folks talking about like from northern states, and they talk about the South as this like very stereotypical thing, and I'm here experiencing, and I'm like, wait, what do you mean? So what about what does Mississippi look like what did it look like in like 1950s, 1960s, and what does it look like today? What are those two differences, like population wise or culturally wise?
Well, the gains of the Mississippi freedom struggle and the civil rights movement more broadly led to openings. So not just in voting and civil rights, but also in work opportunities. So for the first time, Black folks could get a job in a chicken plant, for example, or in other manufacturing. So to some extent, I guess if you want to compare sort of pre-civil rights to post-civil rights in these sort of rural poultry areas, these jobs, which today we look at, as really grueling, dangerous, and certainly underpaid jobs, were opportunities for folks to move up out of the types of economic positions, or at least relationships with white landowners and home like patronas, what am I thinking in English? Right, the women that they worked for in homes. It gave them some degree of independence.
I feel like that sense of like it's a step up is something that either I hear or can identify with as like something immigrants really like either adhere to or like identify with, is like pues ya pues crucé un paso más, or you know, I got an extra dollar or something like that. So yeah, I can definitely sympathize with some of what you say there.
Yeah, and I think early on when Black folks gained entrance into poultry, this was a real gain.
Yeah.
But then as the decades wore on, you know, they thought, oh gee, this is really hard work. We are being exploited, right? People who are being exploited by capitalism, more often than not, we know the position that we're in, but we don't have the power to change it, right? But throughout the actually late 70s into the 80s and the 90s, Black poultry workers in Mississippi started organizing, and they were trying to get enough power to demand better working conditions and a raise in their wages. And it was in this moment, actually, in the early 90s, when they were starting to gain traction, and they actually, and they had union representation, and the plants were about to be forced to bargain with them over these issues, that the plants declared a labor shortage and went searching for a new class of workers to bring into the plants. And if you look at the ways in which this was being talked about in the industry in the 90s, they're saying we just couldn't find enough people to work on the line. And you talk to Black workers who were around then, and they'd say, oh, there were plenty of us, and we wanted to work, but we had demands. And instead of meeting our demands, they decided to look further afield for a new sort of, how could they flood the labor supply so that they didn't have to meet these demands?
You mentioned a phrase in what you write, or I think it's a title, and it mentions it's like speaking from like from working to the fields and to the factory, and that the factory becomes the new, I don't know if it's the new farm or like the new kind of, I forget.
Oh, I think at one point in the book I talk about, I use the term plantation capitalism, and thinking about how there's a literal move from the plantations into these factories.
Yeah, from these like big agricultural things, and now it's like operating within the factory. Before going to search for this, I guess, new labor or new humans to come replace it, why were they like, what was the population within Mississippi or other parts of the South that kind of essentially segregated or very like discrete group of like owners and workers? Like what did they look like in terms of race and in terms of socioeconomic status?
So by the time the chicken plants in Mississippi went out to recruit Latinx immigrant workers, the plants were run by white men almost exclusively, and staffed almost entirely by Black women and Black men. Folks who were part of that integration of African-American folks into the plants would tell stories about how it was, in one plant, it was a matter of weeks before all the white women left. So there was this very sort of hard line of what's the work of Black folks and what's the work of white folks, and that the two couldn't mix. I met very few white poultry workers who weren't in management when I was doing my research. That's
interesting, because I think the industry that comes to mind that I've seen more visible during my time growing up in North Carolina is, I mean, to say a couple, is it's like construction work, right? And that's kind of how I identify the groups, and where I see populations of immigrants or similar nationalities just overrepresented, really. And then like I've worked at a restaurant, I've served. So as a server, you're like, you have people speaking in English serving, but if you ever go to the back of the kitchen, whether it's a American burger restaurant, an actual Hispanic restaurant, or even a Chinese restaurant, it always seems to be like a Hispanic or immigrant population working the kitchens. So I guess what I wanted to ask is, like, for those people who were white poultry workers who were non-management, how did they kind of like interpret the place that they were in or the workers they were with? I don't know, how did they rationalize what they were doing or the work they had?
That's an interesting
I don't know
question.
if you got an answer from them about that.
Yeah, Axel, I really didn't, because there were a couple of white women who were involved in one of the
Hmm.
unions, and I mean, they were com- in complete solidarity with both Black
Mm.
and immigrant workers. And I had hoped for the opportunity to get to know them better, and they were killed in a car crash
Oh gosh.
one night coming home from the casino, along with their partners who were immigrants, actually.
Mm.
Yeah, that was really very tragic, but I had just sort of started interacting with them through a union campaign that was going on, and thought, wouldn't it be interesting to hear what these women have to
Yeah.
say about their experience? So I don't know. I think you probably don't want to include that in the podcast, but I can
No,
say,
it's possible though. Actually, what you're even sharing is even more interesting, and I'll share why personally. Is because in the place I am right now, rural Sampson County, it's heavy on agriculture. Really, it's heavy on not. There are chicken, like huge, massive chicken coops, and maybe we can describe what those look like. But and there's also meat processing plants as well, and so you have immigrants working there. But what I've seen with some of the younger generations of students I work with is that they're coming from mixed families as well, and not mixed
Mhm.
just in terms of the nationalities, but even in terms of the generations of immigrants. So maybe it's like a second, third generation immigrant, and they're identifying more as Southern, or it's, you could say, I guess, to some extent, like biracial or bi-ethnic. I don't know what the terminology would be, of like either American females who are white, and typically like Hispanic males who are doing all the work. So that's something I've noticed and been like, oh, this exists, which is
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And these folks are having children, like you're saying, and these are part of Nuestro South, right? These young people that are coming up. It might be worth saying, different parts of the South are, the South is not a monolith,
Mhm.
and the demographic makeup of different parts of the South is very different. I know you've looked at stuff related to Appalachia. Um,
Yeah, no, I mean, I've, if you actually were to travel across the South and these different states, their histories are different. The ways their economies have developed are different. I mean, we're talking about Mississippi, and I don't know if there's, besides poultry, but there may be other like very like strong sectors. I mean, if you look at a map of North Carolina, like you can see the specific parts where hog farming is dominant. You're not going to have that in the mountains just
mhm.
by a simple fact of geography, but different things end up happening in those areas.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of give a small bit of recap, just in a concise question, of how did race come to play in those like labor or organizing efforts in the 70s, and how does it play, what role does it play now, more recently, in the last couple of decades?
Yeah. So I think the story that I'm telling is that, in the moment that Black folks started to organize for better wages and working conditions, the plants brought immigrants in.
Hmm.
And that this is very much an industry that is thinking and strategizing about
Hmm.
what is the lowest possible labor cost, and how do we construct that through an exploitable labor force,
Mm.
whether that's disempowered Black folks that have just come off out of the plantations decades ago, or whether that's new immigrants today who don't have sort of the cultural connections, or don't have the language, and maybe don't have papers, right? And
Yeah.
so are very also easily exploitable. And I think in the moment that immigrants start to organize, this industry is also thinking ahead to
Yeah.
what's the next possible labor force to keep costs down and to keep profits up.
That's such a difficult problem to solve. We were talking about these different workers on the plan, and even some like workers, females who were white, and actually maybe had partners that were immigrant or Hispanic, that I guess they had this consciousness of being supportive, mostly probably based on knowing their own histories, knowing their partner's stories, and then knowing what they experienced, on the job conditions. But getting to do that across like a diverse set of like individuals, groups, is much more difficult. So you got a chance to do some of that work actually, which is super difficult, through the Mississippi Poultry Workers Center, trying to do this kind of deeper level of organizing to get folks to get an awareness not only of their own condition, but each other's, right, in terms of different groups. Can you share a little bit of what the work of the Worker Center was about, and then kind of what you were able to develop as well as part of your time there?
Yeah, I got to work with the Mississippi Poultry Workers Center over a period of about 6 years. And we started as sort of this loose collaboration of folks who were seeing the transformation of their communities and their workplaces because of the recruitment of new Latin American immigrants from across the continent too. I think it's worth saying, right?
Yeah.
That the heterogeneity of among Latin American immigrants in this moment in Mississippi, and even till today, I think is really broad. And so I think in the North Carolina context, folks often think about people from Mexico or maybe Guatemala, right?
Yeah.
Maybe Honduras.
Yeah.
In Mississippi, there was a large community of Mexicans and of Guatemalan Maya Mam people, but also Peruvians and Argentines and Uruguayans, and there had been Brazilians and Dominicans, and it was just, so even thinking about the immigrant population as some sort of cohesive group didn't work, right? But the work of the Workers Center, we did some of that sort of inter-Latinx identity work and community building, but a lot of
it's like trying to build an identity that isn't supposed to exist, but you try to build it based on, like, I guess, worker solidarity. Oh man, that's tough.
Yeah. What we found was that unions, there are some unions in the chicken plants, and their work was, unions in the South are so limited in the work that they can do because they're so under-resourced and there's so much anti-labor sentiment in our region. So, the unions were lucky if they could service the contracts that they had, if they could help workers who had a grievance file a grievance, and if they could keep their contract at a plant and not lose it. But they were really appealing to workers to come together on the basis of being workers. Yeah. And what we were learning at the Workers Center was that people didn't share an identity that enabled them to create a common vision or to talk about their problems in ways that would allow them to relate to one another and imagine, to recognize that they were sort of in the same boat. And so some of the work of the Worker Center involved trying to build those bridges and helping Spanish-speaking new immigrant workers learn the histories of racial oppression of our country and of the South and of their coworkers, right? And help Black worker leaders understand who immigrants are and where they're from and why they're coming, and no, they're not here to take your job, right? And sort of talking across differences that are really misunderstandings, miscommunication that's fomented, I think, by the industry in order to keep workers from coming together.
Yeah, that's such a necessary work, because I've shared this before with others, but if you are in work conditions like this, if you are being exploited to different degrees, but if your work is, essentially exploiting you, if we talk about working in factories or something like the poultry processing plants, it's constant, right? And by the time you leave work, you're exhausted, you have family to take care of. It's so there's no time to kind of develop this awareness and organizing and do all this extra work to get the conditions and rights that you deserve as a worker. And I've seen it with my family. So I can see how difficult it is to develop this awareness when you're trying to survive, right, on a day-to-day basis. I wanted to ask, because of that, from some of the folks that you work with that were immigrants, because I'm curious about this myself, and I've discussed it with my parents, how did they did they have this kind of concept or familiarity with a sense of labor rights, whether from their own countries or from other places that they had worked in the US? I ask this because, for example, my parents have never experience something like, hey, let's join a union. I'm not sure how much of a concept they have about that. But then I have a couple uncles in New York that, because it's New York, they have this idea of like, oh, estoy con la unión ahora, ya me van a dar buen pago. And so it's like, that to me is just like kind of impressive to realize that even just across those states, there's those differences. So the workers you worked with in that time, did they have this concept of unions and labor organizing from somewhere?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it really depended on folks' life stories, right, and where they had come from. We saw that, for example, folks who came from Argentina had a real sense of what unions did, and were enthusiastic, and were actually like super frustrated that the unions weren't doing
like
more.
Finally.
Right. And, you know, that wasn't true maybe for workers from Mexico, where unions were, you know, part of this 75-year sort of chokehold on the government. This is not exactly related to the labor question, but I think important, and something that you that your last comments made me think of. A lot of the Black worker leaders that we worked with at the Worker Center were so ready when they learned about immigrants' histories and stories to build alliances with them, because they saw so clearly from their own histories and the struggle and the freedom struggle of the U.S. South, and of the whole United States, really.
Yeah.
Right. They could very quickly make connections between their experiences of oppression and those that they were learning about from their Latinx immigrant coworkers that they hadn't understood before.
Yeah.
One of the things that we found was that it was much harder for most Latinx workers to make that leap, to identify with Black coworkers. And I think in part it was, you know, not having the same recent history of racial and class struggle in the same way, but also, I mean, some people did, right? There were certainly struggles happening all across Central America around the same time and more recently, but whiteness has such a hold on all of us.
Yeah.
Right? One of my scholar heroes, George Lipsitz, talks about the possessive investment in whiteness, and how all of us in the country, arguably in the globe, have an incentive to invest in the structures of white supremacy and in order to try to benefit from those structures. Yeah. And so part of what I write about and what we thought about a lot in the Worker Center was how anti-Blackness among Latinx immigrants is really impeding the ability to work across racial lines. And that's not an easy or comfortable thing to talk about, but I think it's really important.
Yeah, and I think when you were talking about that, when you were referencing, I was like, I guess what came to mind for me is generations and education to some extent, but mostly generations, because, for example, my uncle or my mom, who came as, I would say, young adults, still had this, just in general, this concept of like what this country was supposed to be, or what it was supposed to look like, or what you were supposed to find in it, right? And for me, having the opportunity to grow up within this country from a young age, very young age, and then like, I guess, see it and witness it and be able to like speak and understand what was being done or what was being said, my awareness of it is a bit more expanded than my parents were. And then this whole other dimension of race, yes, it operates, or of whiteness operates within Latin America, and it definitely continues here. And I guess those are the two things that come to mind. Kind of that generational gap of like you were saying, Black Americans just understood not only their own context, but how they could relate, how immigrants were being exploited already in similar ways, right? But we don't come with that knowledge. We get dropped in this country, and then takes some time to realize a lot of those realities and a lot of those things that are just like structural and that we think we can benefit from, but not necessarily. So for me, yeah, my frustration sometimes is that I've had the time to give myself to the reading, the listening, the the just arguments and debate. But our folks who are like my parents, who are working on a day-to-day basis, don't. So I wanted to ask you, with those that you were able to work with, you talk about popular education efforts and kind of this way to go beyond, I guess, academia or like structured school education. How does kind of those popular education efforts help start developing some of that critical awareness by folks, and then just even bridging some of those efforts across groups?
So the popular education models that we drew on in that work, and that many people draw on, come out of Latin America, right? Out of a history of struggle, specifically the work of Paulo Freire in Brazil, who really sort of turned education on its head, in the sense that when you're working with any group of people, rather than assuming that they're like empty vessels that need to be filled with knowledge, what happens when we recognize that the lived experience that people bring into the room with them is a resource, and that everything that we know from life can be utilized to help to help us understand a new concept, or to help us relate to someone else, or to help us build a political consciousness. And so the education work that we did through the Workers Center was really about building, how do we build political consciousness and recognize this whole person that has come in with a world of knowledge to share and to relate. And so we used those types of popular education techniques and theories to help people, begin to understand what their basic rights are, in particularly immigrant workers, but also US-born workers, what their rights are as workers, what their rights are as humans, and as people in the United States, regardless of documentation, right? Regardless of legal status. And then how, once they understood those rights, how could we then begin to relate to one another as humans with particular experiences with the structures of power, with oppression, with resistance and struggle, and begin to sort of map those out. So we had a timeline that stretched across a wall. Maybe I can show you some pictures of a big wall of a room, and different immigrant and US-born worker groups that came in would plot out sort of the history of their people and their own histories.
Yeah.
And then we could see the ways in which those sort of intersected, and they layered, and they built on one another over time, using pictures and stories in ways that helped people learn more about their own people's histories, and also begin to connect with other people's stories, and based on that, imagine working together.
What were a couple things that just kind of surprised you? I don't know, this may have been a while back, but just surprised you as things that people just came to realize and acknowledge as realities that others face that they had no clue about beforehand?
Let's see. One thing that always sticks with me to this day is Black worker leaders who, we talked about histories of slavery and of segregation and of resistance in the Mississippi freedom struggle, and sort of their own stories in that struggle, and their parents. The thing that really blew their minds was that there were Black folks in other parts of the Americas.
Oh.
Like the fact that the transatlantic slave trade was not just to the southern US.
Yeah.
It was to Brazil, it was to the Caribbean, it was up and down our continent, America, right?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that was just incredible to them. And I remember there was one woman who was a real leader in her workplace who was Afro-Nicaraguan.
Mhm.
And she said people would come up to her all the time and say, "What are you?" Like it did not fit in people's worldview that you could
Yeah,
be Latin American and Black. And
yeah.
that was transformational for people.
No, that's super interesting because that's I mean, I'm familiar with even the opposite of that happening, right? Just Latinx folks being like, oh, there's Black Latinos who, they just, oh, that's so interesting because and this is why like the South maybe is an important context in itself, right? For maybe Black folks to realize that the Latino workers that are coming from aren't just, let's say, Mexican folks who look somewhat brown or vary from all different shades, but you can have someone go to New York, like a couple of my family members who, I guess, in the US, they are racialized directly as Black, but there's kind of a benefit that they get by, especially if they're undocumented immigrants, by kind of like blending in within the, Puerto Rican, Dominican communities or African American communities that exist in places like New York City.
Mhm.
So that makes things so so specific, so nuanced, and so in a sense weird when you have those conversations actually in a place like rural Mississippi or rural North Carolina or Georgia,
Yeah,
where the history seems very binary.
totally. Yeah. Some other examples that I can think of are when we were looking around for popular education materials that we could use, we had a hard time finding things. I think there's a lot more now for having intergroup dialogue. But one of the sources that we found really useful was Teaching Tolerance through the Southern Poverty Law Center. And we used a few of their films. And one was just as sort of an introduction to the violence that was Jim Crow.
Mm.
And the ways in which folks of conscience fought back, and sort of a introduction to the civil rights movement. And we shared that with a workshop of Latin American folks who were just, I think their jaws were on the floor.
Mm.
And they said, I had no idea that had happened here. And so recently. And it just also, I think, opened people's perspective to the possibility of considering what their Black coworkers, perspectives might be on race and exploitation in the chicken plants or in
Yeah,
the South.
I think one of the necessities for that is, from my experience, there's a lot of, I feel like a lot of immigrants tend to easily buy into this sense of, rugged individualism or personal responsibility that like, if you give me the work, I'll make it, I'll, get myself out of this and, pick myself up and, you know, do well. And then from that, there's the extension of like, why can't everyone else? Right. And when you had mention of status and maybe you're an immigrant who's working yourself almost to death, right, without any basic rights or benefits, but at least you have that car, at least you're able to pay the rent, and without a status there's kind of that friction and tension of like, why can't others do it, right? And I think it definitely comes into play with the immigrants and towards the Black population or African American population in this country. So until you kind of get some grounding experience to understand that history, I feel like a lot of immigrants tend to like just buy quickly into that narrative of
Right,
personal responsibility.
right. And we're the hard workers, right? In comparison to these other folks who don't want to work.
Yes, yes, and
And
you mentioned that. You mentioned that a little bit. That kind of even the way that immigrants themselves were perceived, they kind of get this benefit of like, oh yeah, we like you because you work, and then anybody else who's not typically Black or African American, you guys are lazy. How did that play out?
yeah, so I think in the Deep South, where we have these, such sort of deeply felt histories of white supremacy and and exclusion, the narrative about immigrants as hard workers is exactly as what you're saying, right? It goes hand in hand with the narrative that Black folks are lazy and don't want to work. And I think you're right that a lot of immigrants come in and not knowing sort of why their African-American counterparts at work might be taking a 10-minute bathroom break or throwing soap in the chiller to get the machines to stop for a while, right? They're not seeing that as resistance. They're seeing that as laziness because that's the dominant narrative. I think it works the other way too, Axel. I think that this narrative of hard work makes a lot of Americans who don't understand the precarities of undocumented status assume that immigrants or Latinx are just hard workers because it's like in their blood, right? And without understanding sort of the nature of the structural precarity that undocumentation places on people, such that they feel like they don't really have a choice but to keep their heads down and work.
And it can get so nuanced. My parents spent over a decade working for a Hispanic immigrant-owned business, right? And for almost over a decade, they probably took 2 to 3 weekends off for years and years, right? And it's been interesting having them kind of get this awareness or consciousness where now they're like, they work Monday through Friday, they have weekends off, they, take some time off. And it's like, I don't know how long it took for you to get here, but for years and years as an early immigrant, you just kind of like, you're just stuck. There's no way you can ask for anything. You just have to do what you were told to do.
How did they get to this new space where they're not working weekends?
Interestingly enough, it's by, they've developed, they changed work, but the way, the location that they're working out now, I think the relationship with the boss is a bit different. I guess you could, if I were to try to like analyze it, they're a bit more proximate to each other. So the owner is kind of like, it's a smaller business, they work together. And so there's a little bit more of that like mutual respect and understanding. And to be honest, the other part is that my stepdad has been doing this for a long time, right? And at that point, unfortunately, but like, yes, after 10, 15, 20 years, you finally make it to a position where you can like, set your terms. But that's probably too long.
Well, and I think if in that position, if you're earning a little bit more, or you've been here longer and you've been able to save little by little by little, you're slowly, I think, put in a position where you feel like you have a little more freedom to set the terms of your labor.
You're willing to take that risk. I have one more kind of broad question or topic. I wanted to just discuss a little bit about talking about Black and brown labor, talking about chicken plants generally in the South. What are some of the things or challenges that they have encountered, especially in times such as a pandemic or with Latino immigrants, what they experience with heightened immigration enforcement, especially over the past 4, 5, 10 years in these settings like Mississippi, rural South, poultry work?
Well, I think you're asking this in early 2021, and a lot has happened. I mean, I think that all of us are coming out of a period of extreme trauma. I don't know if that's the wrong word, but I don't know, these 4 years of this administration that's been so white nationalist and so hateful toward immigrants of all stripes and backgrounds, and certainly of African-American folks and anyone who stands up for against white supremacy. I think we're in a moment now where maybe we're feeling hopeful, but people are really beleaguered too after, all the police brutality on Black folks around the country and the raids that have that really escalated under the Trump administration. In Mississippi, the chicken plants were raided in the summer of 2019. in a massive raid, actually the largest immigration raid in US history, happened at these chicken plants. And nearly 700 people were taken in the raids, which of course affected thousands of children and pretty much everybody in, you know, in rural communities. Everybody's connected, right? And the economy is all connected. And in these poultry towns, I think in Mississippi, as well as in North Carolina and Georgia and Alabama and Arkansas, right? The economy revolves around poultry. So the immigration raids have had really, I think, reverberating effects on the schools, on local economy, on families, and on the chicken business as well. And then of course there's the pandemic.
Yeah, I have two questions. Yeah, and that's a whole other one. Hopefully we'll discuss a little bit more of, just because that one's so specific, and it's impacted people just by default because of the conditions that they're made to work in. But to the topic of immigration, like chilling effect, one, I wanted to ask, if you could elaborate why these like small poultry towns exist, and like what do you mean by that? And then two, I'm curious, like what the politics of, you know, the folks that run the plants and then that hires the label, how do they either rationalize or do they react against some of these like immigration raids efforts?
How did poultry towns come to be across the South? This industry founded itself in the South from the very beginning. So like 75, 80 years more, 85, close to, since the 1930s, right? That this industry started really becoming an industry. And it's been in the South practically the entire time, because there is a large pool of poor folks who are willing to work for less, because there is land that is relatively inexpensive, because there's anti-labor legislation, which makes it easier to operate, because there have been lots of tax incentives to attract these businesses. And so they set up in small rural areas where there's lots of land around to grow chickens, and where there's really no other economic opportunity.
Yeah, so it's kind of like trapped into that.
Yeah, and you know, back in the day, these were local companies that were set up by white men in these areas. Today, they're almost all bought out by multinationals.
I have just the two last closing questions that you can answer briefly to wrap up. What is the poder that Southern Black and Brown workers can possess?
Well, I think we saw in the work that I was describing for you at the Mississippi Poultry Workers Center that when folks recognize a shared path, both looking backwards and looking forward, there's a lot of power. There's a lot of potential. If folks can see each other as fully human and as someone with whom I can align my fate, right? Sort of recognizing, that we have a shared fate, and that our coming together is necessary in order to confront these really entrenched issues of racism, structural racism, capitalism. I mean, these are huge institutions, right, that shape our lives. But I think that Black and Brown folks together with other allies we have the power to change this system.
That's definitely a process and a journey, and I'm excited. I think at least for what the purpose of this conversation is, to kind of help younger generations also start exploring that and get a glimpse through the stories we share and the conversations we have about what that history is and how they plug into it, right? I have hope. I'm hopeful in many ways despite the circumstances. And lastly, based on your experience or your work, especially, given the broad knowledge you have of South, whether it's Mississippi or more closer to movements here across North Carolina, what is something that for you represents this concept of Nuestro South that we're trying to, explore?
I have a couple of thoughts. And one, I think, is really along the lines of what you all are doing with Nuestro South, which is there's a whole generation of young people that are growing up that were, when I was in Mississippi doing this work, were children, but are now coming of age and feel themselves to be fully American and fully Southern. And this is home.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that the work that you all are doing with Nuestro South to, reappropriate and underscore that belonging, right, is really important. And it's certainly something that I've seen in Mississippi that didn't exist, in the 90s when folks started arriving, as we just heard, or in the early 2000s when we were doing our work. But the other answer that I would give to this is not about children who either are born here or came young and grew. It's about new immigrants and immigrants who've been here for a while, who have, as our friend said, really put down deep roots and have thought about going elsewhere, but this is home. Like, I can't pull this root up, right? I think that there are a lot of, in my work, I've met a lot of really brave people who did speak up in the face of injustice, despite all the risks, because they felt it so deeply in their bones, a question of justice, but also staking a claim that I belong here too, right? And that this is our South, and this is our country, new or old. This is where I'm sort of placing my bets or putting down my roots. So
I totally feel that. And honestly, I think for immigrants, time is almost like with children. I guess time just kind of passes for you, and you have no awareness of like what 10, 15, 20 years down the line may be, right? Those first 4 or 5 years, or you go through a roller coaster of experiences and emotions. But as you start maturing, as my family comes to 15, 16 years, I think we start realizing that, hey, this is something we can own. This is something that can be ours. And it's very weird to start realizing that while still being in, like you mentioned, this kind of precarious, vulnerable state, given the circumstances, but it does happen.
It does happen. And I think people, there's a shift in a lot of immigrants at some point from an orientation toward home and the plan of what I'm going to do when I get back to, at least for folks who choose to stay, to an orientation to this is home, right? And this is where I belong. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Angela Stuesse. We appreciate your time. This has been a great conversation, and we hope that it's useful for many other folks to think about race, think about labor, think about Southern Mississippi Polleras chicken plants, and how that can apply to their own history.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me and for making space for both of us to talk about our experiences and what it has meant to become Southern. Thanks so much.
I like that, to become Southern.
I mean, for me, it was a choice, right? I wasn't born here either, but I came and this is home.
Well, thank you so much.